Hello, and welcome back to Personality. In the last episode, in the last lecture, um, we went over the theories of psychodynamics and personality based on the works of one Mr. Sigmund Freud, who by many accounts, is the poster child still and the face of psychology, since he was the one that came up with the ideas for modern clinical psychology. Um, his original theories were a little out there, a little rough around the edges, not very scientifically testable, but, it gave us the basis for the powerful impact that we have now on therapy and things like that. So you got to kind of take it with a grain of salt. Once we got out of the Freudian and Neo-Freudian era, remember that with behaviorism that we talked about in chapter 7, learning, the different types of learning, behaviorism dominated with Watson and Skinner, dominated psychology for close to 40 years. And even before Watson and Skinner came along, Freud's ideas of personality stemming from unconscious conflicts, centered around this idea that a lot of it was automatic, right? So when we get into the idea of Freud and his mostly stemming from unconscious processes that we can't get to ourselves, combine that with behaviorism, which talked about learning and looking at behavior. And in this case, we didn't really need mental processes, because what Freud argued is that most of the mental stuff that we do, or the stuff that causes problems at least, is unconscious and we can't get to it. With behaviorism, which dominated psychology from, again, 1920 to about 1960, we had the idea that you only needed to observe, you didn't need to worry about emotions or mental processes. So between the unconscious Freudian theory that you wouldn't even be able to unlock it other than himself, and the behaviorist dominating most of the first half of the 20th century, conscious thought and cognitive processes and emotions and things like that were almost gone. They were almost lost forever. Until this thing we called the cognitive revolution, if you remember back from the prologue. The cognitive revolution was actually started by these two individuals, Abraham Maslow and his self-actualizing person, and Carl Rogers with his person-centered perspective. These are the ones that led the idea of mental health and therapy and things like that out of the dark unconscious and more into the light of bringing back mental processes and emotions that actually mean a lot. So these are our humanistic theorists, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. In Maslow's self-actualizing person, Maslow focused on potential for healthy personal growth. So what can you do for yourself? By helping yourself, right, you're able to become a better person and a better version. So Maslow focused on this potential for growth and people striving for what he called self-determination and self-realization. So once you worked on the needs that you actually sought out, once you had those needs met, then you could work on setting goals and being the best version of yourself. So he created something called the hierarchy of needs. And he said that people are motivated by this hierarchy of needs that need to get taken care of step by step. And once you do that, then you can strive towards setting bigger and better goals and being the best version of yourself by working on yourself the whole time. Carl Rogers, on the other hand, said, it's really how you treat others that says a lot about you and your growth potential. So Rogers posited that growth-promoting environments' characteristics are being very genuine and not being fake, accepting others no matter what their background holds, and empathy, meaning that you can understand and put yourself in another person's shoes and feel their strifes and their stories and things like that, and you can understand them. And he used keywords like unconditional positive regard and self-concept, which were key to the theory. So we're going to explore those in a second. So Maslow, this is his hierarchy of needs. I don't think this picture's in the book. I actually got it from elsewhere. So you can find it anywhere online, of course. So in Maslow's view, people are motivated to keep moving up this hierarchy of needs, growing beyond just getting some basic needs met. Here, we see that there are levels to this. At the top, we see things like self-actualization, which means fulfilling one's potential. Self-transcendence means having the means for yourself to get to that next level, transcending to a higher version of yourself or a higher plane, bigger and better goals, and doing all that you can. But before you can get to that, you can see there's a bit of a separation in this hierarchy, in this pyramid, between some of the needs and then being able to actually get into self-actualization and self-transcendence. So really quickly, let's see what this the words are at the bottom right. In an ideal state, once you get there, a personality includes being self-aware, self-accepting, open, ethical, spontaneous, loving, caring, and focusing on a greater mission than just being part of something. We talked about in the last chapter in social psychology the need to belong, to be part of a group, to be social. We're really feeling that now, even though we have tons of Zoom meetings. And how do you think you're getting this lecture, right? So looking at the needs that you need to have met before you can even think about setting goals for yourself. Maslow says there's physiological needs, and those are the things that without them, you pretty much die. So definitely those would be at the bottom rung. Those would be the most important. Physiological needs: food, drink, warmth, shelter, right? Those types of things. The things that without them, you can't survive. So those are your survival needs, basically. After that is safety. You need to know that you feel safe, protected, comfortable, right? Those types of things. Once those safety needs have been met, at least enough, then you can work on belonging. And I think more recently, some modern theorists have said that instead of calling it belonging, there's also either a separate love need or it's sort of part of the belonging needs. So you can understand that needing to belong to a group, needing to be able to identify as something. Like I said from social psychology, I identify as a father, as a husband, as a professor, as a fan of music, as a fan, as a Laker fan, and all of these different things, right? So we all have a sense of belonging to certain clubs with certain groups, fraternities, sororities, right? Or just, groups online, Facebook groups. And in that sort of belonging is also that need for love. Love from your family, maybe love from a significant other, some type of thing there. Do you need to have somebody in order to move up on this list? No, you can still be single and do it, But then we get to esteem needs. So self-esteem, like we talked about at the end of the last chapter. Self-esteem is your feelings of self-worth. And you need to be worthy enough of yourself that you can set goals and actually get them done. If your self-esteem is pretty low, good luck being able to self-actualize or to reach a level of self-transcendence, as Maslow called it. So you need those other needs met first, and then you can start to fulfill your goals towards, quote, living your best life, unquote, right? With Rogers, again, it's not centered on yourself, but it's how you treat others that makes you a better person. So he said that people have natural tendencies to grow, to become healthy, and move towards this idea, same idea, self-actualization, the ability to live your best life, set goals, and do the ideal, right? And so he said that there are 3 conditions that facilitate growth, just like water, nutrients, and light make a tree grow into its best potential. And those 3 things, as I talked about, were genuineness, acceptance, aka unconditional positive regard, and empathy. So in genuineness, it's not being fake, being very honest, being very direct, and not using a facade. Facade is a French word that means false front, like a lot of movie sets have people going into buildings and there's actually nothing in the building. It's a facade, it's a fake front. So this is a word that's used for somebody that, is nice to your face and then maybe behind your back says some bad things about you. If you are using a facade, if you're not being upfront and honest with people, you're not being genuine, and that's not going to help you grow, according to Rogers. Acceptance is unconditional positive regard, which basically means knowing that there's feelings. There may be automatic things, right? Biases, as we talked about in the last chapter, without passing judgment, though. Knowing that people have different backgrounds, different stories, different things, and being okay with that. Accepting them as a person, as a human being, before worrying about what color their skin is or what religion they are or anything like that. Um, so if you're able to do that, that makes you grow as a person, right? And empathy, of course, means turning into the feelings of others, putting yourself in their shoes, um, understanding what they're going through, and understanding their struggle, and listening, being there for them. And if those things are part of your daily routine, how you treat others, then you yourself can grow as a person and become the best version of yourself. So this is not obviously going to get into as in-depth as Freud and the psychodynamic theories, but this idea of humanistic psychology, right, I needed to point out that it brought back the idea of mental processes, because in humanistic psychology, one of the things that deviated from this psychodynamic personality theories is instead of Freud saying, hey, I'm only going to look at the people who are struggling, those that aren't struggling, you guys are fine. You don't need me, and I don't need you. But in humanistic psychology, right, it's about growth promoting environments. It's about what's going on. Why can some people do it better than others, right? So in humanistic psychology, and this is really where that cognitive revolution came back, Maslow and Rogers said, in order to know why some people are struggling more than others, we should see if there's a difference in the way that they think and the way that they feel for the people that are struggling to get this concept of themselves. Where are those needs that they're struggling with versus the people who don't struggle? Maybe they have a different mindset. Maybe they have different ways that they deal with things. Maybe they have people in their life that are holding them up and saying, you can do this. Whereas the people on the other end that are struggling may not have people, or they may have parents or family members, community members that don't really help themselves, right? They just kind of like, just get it done, or whatever. Whereas in a growth promoting environment, you have friends, you have coworkers, you have classmates, you have teachers, you have family members saying, you can do this. I know you can. I believe in you. And that really does, when you talk about things like self-esteem needs and belongingness needs, that's where this idea that our cognitive processes, our thoughts, our feelings, emotions are just as in the psychodynamic realm, which again is still being done today. For humanistic, that's not going to cut it. We're not looking for a spontaneous first thing that comes to mind. In humanistic psychology, now that they brought back this idea that thoughts are just as important as behavior, then they wanted to use personality assessments that could get people to evaluate how they feel about themselves. Their self-concept is what it was called. Now, so your current standing in life, or where you think you are at, which relies on your own cognitive processes, and where you want to be. So where's your ideal self, right? So where you are now is what Rogers would refer to as your actual self, somewhere along a spectrum, maybe right in the middle, and living your best life or your ideal life. What would the perfect life look like for you? And so what Rogers wanted to do specifically, as he met with people multiple times over the course, right? Therapy once a month or so. he would judge where they are versus their actual self versus their ideal self. And if he got that gap to close, if their actual self, over months and years would get closer to the ideal self, that's how they measured progress, right? So, looking at humanistic theories, this was in the early 1960s when they started, around the time of hippies and anti-war and things like that. So you may see a little influence sort of creeping in, but let me show you. For humanistic theories, we could see the influences, right? Growth promoting environments, do better by being better to others, do better for yourself. The influences were counseling, of course, and the new version of therapy. In education, getting students to see their potential and know that they can do better with the right support and believing in themselves. Child raising, of course, and management skills, management styles. This also laid the groundwork for a type of psychology that was invented around this time called positive psychology. And positive psychology um, is basically believing and thinking positive thoughts in helping you. Now, not that it's like some magic formula, but if you think about positive psychology in a form of those that have maybe like a terminal illness, like a cancer or an HIV or something like that, that threatens their life. Those that think positive and have more of an upbeat, I'm going to make the best of my life for as long as I have left. Those are the ones that tend to stick to a specific diet if needed for this disease, um, take their meds regularly, focus on the positive things in life, and those people tend to live longer. I don't know how much longer, that's relative to the diagnosis and things like that. But the people who are negative or pessimistic and they're like, well, I've been given a death sentence, so what's the point? Those are less likely to follow a specific diet. They're less likely to take their meds, and they're more likely to just give up and sort of, throw in the flag a lot earlier. So positive psychology shows that there is a lot of power in positive thinking. Um, so that's sort of what humanistic psychology evolved into, which positive psychology is still around today. And of course, we know that this was the cognitive revolution, or started the cognitive revolution, that renewed interest in the concept of self. So these are all really good things to come out of humanistic psychology. Positive psychology, very, you know, um, very good to bring back cognitive processes and things like that instead of just behavior. Of course, no theories are without their criticisms. One of the things that people said about um, humanistic psychology is that sometimes the concepts themselves are pretty vague or they're very personally subjective. There's no one size fits all. Some people have to work on certain deficits, some people have to work on other things, but there's nothing really specific for people to do in that case. They're very vague concepts. Um, Especially when we talk about Maslow, one of the biggest criticisms of Maslow is that Maslow says you got to take care of yourself. You got to look at your own needs, take care of yourself before you can do anything else or set goals, or, that may even be before you help other people. So a lot of people criticized Maslow and his hierarchy by saying it was too selfish because it advances individualism, all about me, and very self-centered values. So you can see where if the whole thing about being a better person is just working on yourself, then you can see where a lot of people just might ignore others in that, right? Um, Obviously, with Rogers, we don't see that as much because Rogers was kind of the opposite. It's how you treat others that makes you a better person yourself. Um, but the overall third and probably the biggest criticism of humanistic theories is that it was in the time of hippies, and it's like, man, if you just like get your needs together, or like you're really good to like everybody, then you can achieve all your goals and be living your best life, man. So it seems very sunshine and rainbows, shall we say, as the video that you'll watch says. And so very hippie, idealistic, even to the point of naively optimistic assumptions. Not everybody's going to be able to be their best version of themselves, and there's a lot of obstacles in your way. But I think the focus, of course, here is more on, well, see what you can do. That doesn't mean you always get to be the best version that you could ever be, but working on it and getting closer is the goal, right? So that's humanistic theories. The next type of theory that we talk about is the one that we would practice in class with the Who Am I, and basically the homework assignment, which is to take the Big Five personality test and see how you feel. The Big Five personality test comes out of what we call trait theory. Humanistic psychology, a little sunshine and rainbows, but it's about growth promotion and using interviews and questionnaires and um, things like that to um, judge people's progress. With trait theories, they're looking at more of the biological side. So when I talked about nature and nurture at the very beginning of class, first week, I talked about the idea of personality traits coming from genetics, right? The biggest one I talked about specifically was the idea of anxiety. Anxiety is genetically driven. We have different versions of genes, and if you get the high anxiety gene, especially from both parents, it's really hard to escape it. So from a trait perspective, these are genetically, biologically derived or influenced, right? So trait theorists see personality, which can change a little bit and fluctuate, but they see it as a stable and enduring pattern of behavior because it's something that, although you can develop different shades of it, it's really present at birth through genetics. So they, instead of trying to explain differences between people, they try to describe the differences on sort of like a spectrum. And then they use this statistical analysis. Don't worry, we're not going to get into stats. If I didn't make you calculate anything in chapter 2 or chapter 1, sorry, I wouldn't make you do it now. But they use something called factor analysis to identify clusters of behavior and tendencies that occur together and try to label them, all the ones that occur together, as a certain characteristic or pattern. And so trait theories really are not looking at unconscious drives. They're not looking at the people who help you in your environment. They're talking about your biological genetic predispositions that influence many traits. Think about if you're outgoing and social, extroverted, versus kind of prefer to be inside and by yourself and have a little more downtime, or what we call introverted. There's people that really like their same routines. If we think of Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, who always has, well, not only his OCD quirks, but every Tuesday is tie night or whatever it was, same spot on the couch, likes the same things every single time, right? I used to work for someone who liked the same things every week in the same order. Or there's people that always want to try something new, go to a new place, go on vacation to somewhere new, try a new restaurant or a new menu item, right? Those types of things. So factor analysis is, again, the statistical procedure that just takes a bunch of behaviors or cluster of things and puts it together so that you have a name for it. I just described being open to new things and trying new experiences versus preferring a routine. In the Big Five personality test, they call that openness to experience. So um, this factor analysis was first used around the late 50s, early 60s, um, or a little around that area, to tap into, in the mid 60s, something like that, to tap into basic components. They used it originally to look at factors of intelligence, street smarts versus book smarts versus, different types of emotional intelligence and things like that. You may have heard some of these terms. But it was Hans and Sybil Eysenck that really developed and used factor analysis to develop the first personality sort of inventory or questionnaire. They really only looked at two main factors because they only factored in two things back then, which was introversion, extroversion, so how outgoing and social, or how sometimes it's interpreted as shy you are, and emotional stability. So are you somebody that's really cool under pressure, or are you someone that freaks out and cracks under pressure, right? So neuroticism, or um, you know, what I talked about as anxiety could come out in these factors. How do you handle pressure situations, right? So these were the two main dimensions that Hans and Sybil Eysenck came up with. And so it looked like this. And so you can see that there's a lot of different words. You could be in between stable and unstable, and in between introverted and extroverted. On the extroverted and stable, bottom right, we see words like leadership, carefree, lively, easygoing. So kind of cool under pressure. Stable and introverted, calm, even-tempered, reliable, controlled. We have unstable and introverted, looking at words like moody, anxious, rigid, pessimistic, reserved. And stable, unstable and extroverted, we see impulsive, changeable, excitable, aggressive, restless, touchy. So what factor analysis did is it took some of these characteristics, some of these factors, and it clustered them together on the spectrum between stable and unstable emotions, and between introversion and extroversion. So where you lie on the spectrum, right? So it clusters these words that you use to describe yourself and puts you in a sort of category as close as it can together. So using factor analysis, Hans and Sybil Eysenck found that many personality traits are actually a function of two basic dimensions, along which we all vary. And unlike Freud, research actually was able to support these ideas that there are these variations, and they seem to be linked to genetic traits. Well, how would that work? Well, looking at things like people who are introverted versus extroverted, a lot of times what we find in people that are extroverted, like myself, pretty high on the extroversion scale, um, tend to have higher baseline levels of dopamine. Remember, dopamine is the one that's excitable. When you do something you like, when you get a rush out of life, um, you have more dopamine. And in fact, on the higher end of extroversion are people that we call sensation seekers, or adrenaline junkies. So these are people that normal life is not good enough for them. So they need your Six Flags Magic Mountain roller coasters, or bungee jumping, skydiving, cliff jumping, right? All of those extreme type of things. And when they have these people that are extroverts, or even the ones that are, adrenaline junkies or sensation seekers, what we see in brain activity is um, they're seeking stimulation because normal brain arousal is relatively low. So they either have lower baseline levels and need more, right? But what we see is in extroverts and sensation seekers is that dopamine activity actually tends to be higher because they need more of that. Sensation seekers are also more likely to abuse drugs that are going to up the ante on life, right? Up their arousal levels. Um, with introverts, right? A lot of people that, and you could do a correlation. I wouldn't say it's an exact causation, but I bet you would find a pretty good correlation between people who consider themselves introverts and people that do not go on roller coasters because they don't like that. That's too much excitement, right? Those that are extroverts tend to be the ones that like that thrill of, maybe not skydiving, maybe not to that extreme, but roller coasters. And those that are considered introverts. And now there's not an exact science there, because there are a lot of people I know that are introverts that love um, going on roller coasters and stuff like that. But I bet you would be able to see a trend, right? And introversion itself is also stigmatized, right? People think that you don't want to be around others, that you're a party pooper. A lot of times people think that being shy is the same thing as introverted. And it's not really true. Introversion is misunderstood as being shy. Shy is kind of like hesitating and not being comfortable around people. There's a lot of people that are introverted that like other people. They just like lower levels of stimulation, and they like more downtime to themselves, right? I bring back this idea. So again, introverted people often seek lower levels of stimulation from their environment. So I bring back the idea of the Friday night test. In my nature nurture argument to the class, if you guys remember back that far, and I'm trying to refresh your memory here, I talked about the Friday night test with my wife and I. Given any given Friday night, regular Friday night, obviously not now in a pandemic when we're not allowed to leave, right? We joke around that a lot of introverts are like, we've been practicing for this our whole lives. But people are still introvert or extroverts. People are still going a little stir crazy. Anyways, but the Friday night test is any given average Friday night, not during a weird pandemic or anything. Um, would you rather stay home and hang out, maybe have a glass of wine and just watch TV? Or would you like to go out anywhere? Go to a movie, go to a concert, go to a bowling alley, whatever it is. Go to a bar. That for introverts, most likely on the Friday night, they would choose to stay in, all things considered normal. Obviously, if it's a special occasion, they're going to probably go out, and if it's their best friend's birthday or something like that, right? For me, on the totally on the extroverted side, would always want to go out, even if it's just something silly like go to a friend's house or go out to eat or something like that and then come back. I'd rather go out, be there, do that. And of course, there are times when introverts want to go out and get something to eat too, but probably don't want to stay out all night, right? Whereas I would be like, let's shut this place down, right? In a sense. So introversion is not shyness; it's just simply wanting lower stimulation, lower levels, and we can see this biologically as well, right? Genetically. Um, so these personality inventories, as you've probably already guessed, are the ways to assess trait theories. You take a bunch of these clusters, you either traits of personality that you assess yourself and put them on a scale, or basically you take these standardized type of tests that ask you, do you prefer this or do you like that, or things like that. So people are going to respond to a bunch of items that are designed to gauge a wide range of feelings and behaviors, and this is how we assess your personality test. Some of you guys talk about, have taken tests either online or, wherever, where you look at type A versus type B personalities, or that you get these letters. The Myers-Briggs test is what it's called. So if you really want to take some of these other ones, some of them you probably have already taken versions of just because it's on social media or some BuzzFeed or something like that. So the tests are empirically derived, which means based on a bunch of other tests and other questions from tests that we've seen in the past, like Psych. And the tests are scored objectively. They're not looked at, it's not personalized like humanistic psychology. You look at the patterns, you put it into the factor analysis, you run the statistics program, and boom, it puts you into a category or it puts you on a spectrum somewhere. So one of these tests is the one that you're going to be taking if you haven't already done so, which is the Big Five test, which I'll sort of expands on the ideas of ISANC. I'll get to that in a second. But some of you guys, if you've ever gone for a job interview, sometimes they give you a test that has like 200 to 300 questions. Sometimes it's a shorter version of it, and it's called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which has now been translated into well over 100 languages for different countries and different native speakers. And what it basically does is it tries to help you see if your personality fits a certain job. Now, you may be sitting here thinking, what does personality have to do with the job, right? Well, let me put a little perspective on it. So if you are going to be somebody that's sitting in a cubicle for hours and hours working on things, chances are you don't want to be somebody that's restless and likes to get up and walk around all the time, because it's not going to be very productive. If you're extroverted and you need to see people, you don't want to be isolated away in a cubicle where you're not going to see anyone. If you're introverted, that might be the best thing for you. For extroverts, I think about a career in sales. If you go into sales, you need to be able to read people, to understand if you're losing them, to keep them engaged, right? An introvert is probably not necessarily going to be the best person for sales, because you have to interact with a lot of people, you have to spend a lot of time, you have to really get to read the room. So, these MMPI, the personality tests that are given, let's just say that there's two candidates for a sales job. They both have the same amount of experience. They both got good recommendations from their past employers. They both have about the same, right, statistics, GPA from school, if that's what they look at. And it's really kind of a dead heat between two people. Well, this is where the tiebreaker would come in, right? So you look at the MMPI, and one of the people, registers as much more on the on the introverted side, and the other person is much more on the extroverted side. So all things equal, if you've got two candidates for the sales job, the one that predicts a better career and better for the company is the one that's extroverted. That's, good for sales. So that's why some of these tests are given to see if the person is a good fit. And sometimes we can really predict things based on these inventories, right? So the one that you guys are going to be taking online, if you haven't already, is the Big Five personality test, which was developed earlier in this decade, around 2011. And it seems to offer what is believed by most to be the most widely accepted picture of personality. So they looked at the ideas of Eysenck with this introversion, extroversion, and emotional stability, which they call neuroticism. And they said there are a few other factors that they didn't really take into consideration that we can see more now that we have, advances in technology and more research and all of that. So they have ones that spell canoe because, we like to spell acronyms. So it configures pretty well. Conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, which is that idea of emotional stability versus instability, openness to new experiences. So how much do you like new things versus how much do you like routine and structure? And of course, introversion, extroversion. They're not necessarily in that order, but in this order, they can spell the word canoe. So there you go. So when you're going through the Big Five research questions, and again, maybe you've already done it, so you don't have time to stop and think. But if you haven't done it yet, or if you want to think about when you did it, it was 50 questions or so that you just give your answer on disagree to agree on a scale of 1 to 5. And it tells you where you'd fall. So calculate somewhere on the spectrum between introversion and extroversion, in between open to new experiences and preferring routines, emotional stability or instability, right? So when you're going through this, or if you've already done it, some of the things to think about when you did it, right? So how stable are these traits? And again, when we think of trait theories and theorists, they're fairly stable because they're genetically driven, predisposed. Can the environment shape it in one way or the other? Of course, traumatic experience could make a person who is very extroverted be very scared to go out in public. It could give people phobias and things like that. But for the most part, it remains pretty stable throughout life. How heritable are they? Again, according to this biological basis, very heritable because it's based on genetics and biology. Do the traits reflect differing brain structures? Right? I would say yes. Think about the emotional systems, the limbic system. People that are more aggressive in nature tend to have more connectivity and different amounts of neurons, maybe in the amygdala and things like that. Have these traits changed over time? Of course, as we develop hormones, as we go through puberty and things like that, you may develop different ways and different things of doing things. But again, it goes back to biologically derived. So have they changed over time? Probably slightly, but you're probably not going to change much from that predisposed form. If you have anxiety, even if you take medication, you can control it better, you're still probably going to be anxious and tend to have more of negative thought process than people who are not anxious and tend to think more on the positive side, right? How well do these traits apply to various cultures? That's something for you to think about. I don't really have one specific answer for you. And do the Big Five traits predict our actual behaviors? Save that question in your head as we continue this, because we're going to talk about people's traits versus their actual behaviors. And what is the biggest influence of it? Is it your traits? Is it the situation you're in? What exactly is it? So stay tuned for that. But looking at the canoe, or the 5 factors of the Big Five personality test, this is where your homework comes in. So looking at the spectrum, you could be on the low side. And by the way, you're going to get a score online of 0 to 40. So 0 to 20 is basically the lower end, which is on the left-hand side here of this chart. And, anything 30 to 40, or maybe even 25 to 40, 28 to 40 is on the higher end. And then maybe if you're right in the middle, you're probably somewhere between 20 and 27 or something like that, where you're kind of like a little of both, right? So before I read off these spectrums, one of the things that I ask for you guys to do, kind of like what you did with the implicit test, is to just give me a reflection, a couple paragraphs, half a page maybe, or however much you feel like writing about taking this test and what you thought. Because there's a lot of times where people think, oh, I know myself really well and I'm this and that. So they have a feeling that I'm going to score high on this. For me, the last one is extroversion, sociable, fun loving, affectionate, right? Wanting to be with other people, always big crowds. I know that I'm really high on the extroversion scale. Some of you guys may really know that you're very introverted or things like that. But you may not be as in tune with yourself as you think. And based on the way that you answer these questions, you may get exactly what you thought you were somewhere on these scales, on these spectrums, or at least one of these categories may surprise you. So, looking at the categories we have conscientiousness. So on the lower end is very disorganized, careless, and impulsive. On the higher end is very organized, careful, disciplined. Um, I don't know necessarily that I agree they're mutually exclusive on one end or the other, because I feel in conscientiousness that I'm very disorganized in my organization. So I have piles everywhere and I'm not necessarily very good at putting them in the perfect order, but I also know where everything is. So I wouldn't call it impulsive, right? I still feel like it's organized. It's just in um, well, I call it organized chaos. My wife doesn't agree. And on the high end of that, of course, is very organized, careful, very disciplined. Agreeableness. On the lower end of the spectrum, you don't trust or agree with people all the time. You're very ruthless, suspicious, uncooperative, very selfish a lot of times, just doing things the way you want to do them and not taking other people into account. On the higher end of that spectrum is agreeableness, soft-hearted, trusting, helpful, always want to help out and work with others. Of course, the emotional stability and instability, they relabeled as rebranded as neuroticism. So on the low end of neuroticism, that's the more stable side. If you've already been somewhere, you know that the hotel is clean or the restaurant is something that you like, you're always going to go to the same place as your default, and you kind of conform to things, to what other people want. So sort of the opposite of selfishness. And in this case, you know what you like, and so you stick with your routine because it's comfortable and it is comforting, right? And things like that. On the right, you have somebody who's very imaginative, prefers variety, always wants to try a new thing. Even if you go to the same restaurant, you're going to try something new on the menu because you want to see what else there is to offer. If you go on vacation, you don't want to just go to some place you've already been. You need to go to somewhere new. Very independent in this case, on the high end. And of course, introversion, extroversion on the very low end are those words: retiring, sober, reserved, very introverted. And on the extroverted side, sociable, fun loving, and affectionate. So please take the Big Five test and just give me a little analysis of, was it exactly what you thought you would feel? How did you feel about the questions? You know, how do you was it exactly what you thought, or were there a couple or maybe all of them that surprised you, and that maybe you don't know yourself as much as you thought you did? I don't know. Tell me about your experience. So a few minutes ago, I asked you to think about what is the biggest influence, and do the big five factors actually predict your actual behavior? One of these things that I talked about in the last chapter in social psychology is that um, when we are with different people, we may show different versions of ourselves, right? So if I hang out with my son, I'm going to be very silly, physical, active. If I'm just hanging out with the wife, a lot of times where I'm a little bit different in my personality, the way I act. If we're in Bakersfield at her family's house, I act even more sort of reserved and toned down a little bit because that's what the situation calls for. So is it my traits that are doing that? Because I'm the same person, but acting a little bit differently depending on who I'm around. Um, and so a lot of times it has to do with the moment that we're in. Um, and So when we ask about, do the big five personality factors, do our personality traits actually control our actual or predict our actual behaviors? Well, we have this person situation controversy. So the idea behind this is that our behavior is influenced not just by our personality traits, but the situation we find ourselves in. So it seems to be an interaction of our inner disposition, our traits, combined with the environment that we're in. Like I said, we can predict average behaviors, right? Friday night test is my average behavior. On average, on any given Friday night with nothing special going on, yes, I want to go out. I'm extroverted. On average, my wife, being introverted, would prefer not to go out, and that's on average. But the situation, is it somebody's birthday? Is it somebody that she likes? Is it something we have reservations for? Is she just feeling a little like I need to go out and get a little more stimulation? Because introverts still enjoy that, just not as much. In general, we say that personality traits are stable. They're socially significant. Again, I can predict on average, Friday night, I'm going out. Introverts, probably staying home more likely. I'd feel pretty good with those percentages. But and we see that personality traits can be predictors of other things down the line. Mortality, people that are adrenaline junkies that may be more likely to be addicted to drugs or do something very dangerous, bungee jumping, skydiving, cliff diving, right? They're probably going to die earlier. So we can predict that their mortality rate will be a little sooner. Divorce, we can tell when people, cheating and impulsive behaviors like that, as well as occupational attainment. I talked about sales being extroverted and working at a cubicle, introverted is probably better if you don't want to get up and walk around. So the consistency of very specific behaviors from one situation to the next is probably pretty weak. How do I know? Even the introvert, right? If they're passing by and somebody's drowning in the ocean and they need their life saved, even though this person doesn't want extra attention, in the situation, they're like, I'm the only one here. I better save that person's life. And even though that may mean getting attention when they don't want it, the situation kind of called for it if it's within your control. So the consistency of very specific behavior is exactly how I'm going to act from one situation to another is very weak. The ones that are predictable is what we would do on average. On average, somebody that is not very open to new things, we're going to predict, like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, they're going to order the same thing, sit in the same spot, do the same thing. But of course, at some point, they have to try something new. So it's the average behaviors that are predictable, average Friday night test. But any moment, the most powerful predictor is the situation, right? Even if I am the most introverted person, I'm still going to be extroverted if that's my job. If I'm a teacher, even if I'm introverted, and we do have some professors in our department that would really qualify as very introverted, but they're out there talking to people, being social, interacting with students because that's part of their job and that's what the situation calls for. And sometimes you might not even know it, how introverted they really are. I mean, I'm definitely not, but that's not the issue. So in this case, even though our traits tell us a lot about our stable patterns on average, there should be some sort of personality theory that talks about this person situation controversy, which is actually what we call social cognitive theory. So Albert Bandura, the man who came up with observational learning and the Bobo doll experiment, remember from chapter 7, he actually started what he called social cognitive theory of personality. And in the social cognitive personality theory, he says that exactly what I just went over in the person situation controversy, which is behavior is not just your personality traits, although that's a strong component of it, but it's the interaction of your traits and the situation that you're in that's going to be the biggest, most powerful um, and accurate portrayal of how you're going to act specifically. So it emphasizes that it's always an interaction between our nature and our nurture. It's the interaction between our personality traits and the situation that we're in. And in this way, he could bring in the ideas of learning, like observation, cognition, your thought processes, and of course, social behavior, how you get along with others, into this idea of who you are, right? We talked about personality as who am I? Well, the different people you identify with in the different situations. If I am with sports fans, if I'm with my high school buddies, I'm going to be kind of idiotic, right? In the way that I act. We're going to kind of act like we always did. If we're watching sports, we're going to act differently than if we're watching a serious movie. And if we have our kids around, we may act a little bit differently than when the kids are not around. If we're at a bar or if we're at home, there may be a difference in the way that we act, right? So that's the idea of this social cognitive perspective. Influences of our social cognitive, the way that we act, is reciprocal, which means that they sort of feed off each other. And this idea that Bandura came with is called reciprocal determinism. In reciprocal determinism, it says that interaction and mutual influences of behavior, internal personal factors, so your traits, and environmental factors, they feed off one another, right? So when you have an interaction of people and environments, you may get a difference in somebody's behavior, and that may change their mindset. And that may in turn evolve their personality in certain situations. So as an example of this really quickly, we talk about let's say that a little girl, maybe she's in second or third grade, goes to a new school. Never really played sports before, doesn't really do that, doesn't know what to expect, kind of scared in a new environment. And so after school the first week, another kid that's trying to be friendly and incorporate her into the mix says, "Hey, why don't you come play soccer with us after school?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know. I've never really played soccer, kind of shy at this point." And the other person says, "Hey, just come play with us. If you don't like it, then you never have to play again, but maybe you'll like it and maybe you'll see." And so she says, "Okay." So she said, "All right, I'm going to try this. I'm probably not going to like it," and blah, blah, blah. So she goes and she plays, and the other people are being really nice to her. And even though she's not that skilled because she's never played before, she goes and she scores a goal, and it makes her feel really good. And then she goes home and she thinks about it. And now you have behavioral influence of playing, and it's kind of changing her mindset from "this is going to suck" to "I don't know anybody," and now she kind of, "Ooh, I even scored a goal, this is kind of nice." So her nature and her nurture have combined, and now, right, let's cut to 4 months later. She's the one that's almost in charge now, playing soccer. She doesn't like any other sport maybe or anything like that, but soccer is social time. And then if any new kids come to the school, she's kind of part of that welcoming committee that says, "Hey, I was in the same boat you were, and I now have really good friends and I love playing soccer and we just have fun." And so that sort of mutual reciprocal thing, that your thoughts and your behaviors, your attitude, your environment all sort of combine to change and they're playing off of each other. So that's what we mean by reciprocal determinism. But what we know specifically about this is when we talk about the traits theories and we talk about social cognitive, is that different people choose different environments. Extroverts choose more stimulation. Introverts, on average, choose less stimulation. So although you may act differently because you have to or because of the situation, on average, you're going to choose what you're more comfortable with. And our personalities shape how people interpret and react to events. So I go back to the power outage problem from the original nature nurture conversation. And and this is where I bring it back to this, right? Somebody who's an extrovert and somebody who's an introvert at the same office building next to each other, the extrovert, right? Or even if it's anxiety or lack of anxiety is a better one, right? So the person with anxiety, power goes out, automatically goes to negative thoughts. The sky is falling. I'm going to get fired. My family's going to hate me. The other person next to them, like me, is on the emotionally stable side, calm under pressure, and says nobody can get work done. They can't expect this to be done. And cool, I get a free break. I'm going to go get a soda, right? Same exact environment, different personality traits, and that's your different reactions, right? In the interaction of individuals in their environment. The extroverted person's like, free break, I'm going to get a soda. Introverted person thinks they're going to get fired and dumped and, all of these things. So the personalities that we have help to create the situations to which people react. When we talk about, from chapter 6, I'm going to bring it back in, when we talk about the fact that our perception is our reality. Some people see a dog and they think scary because dogs scared them or they got bit when they were little, and that helps to create the situation. They think dogs are scary, they need to run away. Other people love dogs, say, I'm going to go pet that dog, or ask if I can pet, because you should get permission for things, right? So the interpretation of their world, your perception of reality is a lot of it is dependent on your personality type. High anxiety, no anxiety, introvert, extrovert, like new things, like routine, right? Things like that is going to be dependent on both the interaction of your personality traits and the situation or environment that you're in. So when social cognitive theorists look at behavior, they build on the concepts of learning and thinking, cognition, and contend that the best way to predict a behavior in a given situation is to look at what they do on average. So again, Friday night test, I would choose the extrovert is more likely to go out, the introvert is more likely to stay in, and they underemphasize unconscious motives like you see in personality psychodynamic theories. They underemphasize emotion, like you would see maybe in humanistic. And to an extent, although traits are a big part of it, they underemphasize that it's completely biological, because you have, right, the environment to contend with. So they don't really use a specific assessment test. It's more of like what they see, what they witness, and what we can see on average, right? It's not a projective test. It's not a questionnaire. It's not a personality inventory. It's just sort of going on what they know and what they see. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is when we ask the question, who am I? We're talking about the self, knowing who we are, being one of the things that in humanistic that Maslow said is being self-aware, knowing what you're doing, aware of where you are, conscious of things that you're doing and how it may reflect yourself in the world. So the exploration of the self in psychology has a long history. From the time that Wundt started it, he talked about consciousness and self and knowing who we are. From William James and his emotions to Gordon Allport in 1943, looking at the self in more modern times, and then humanistic psychology, which started the cognitive revolution. Bringing it to where we are today. The self is one of the most studied topics. Remember with Karen Horney and everything, talking about self-help. Yes, we like therapy and having somebody talk to us and adjust, but there are things we need to do to be able to do that. Breathing exercises, meditation, right? All of this is how to help ourselves. So self is one of the most studied topic. And in the middle of our personality, what is the fundamental question we've been asking this whole chapter? Who am I? So it is the self at the end of it, whether it's how you are helping yourself according to Maslow, or how you are helping others, right, according to Rogers. Rogers also talked about this idea of possible selves to motivate people. So we have the actual self, which is where you are today. You have your ideal self, which is best life, right? Living your best life. And then you have many different possible selves. You have the possible self that doesn't finish school because it's too hard in this online environment. You have the possible self that doesn't transfer and just gets your AA, maybe. You have your possible self that goes all the way to master's or a PhD or a doctorate. towards your positive development. You can drop out right now and get a job because that's what's needed. There are many different scenarios, many different possible selves that you can have. And so in this case, Rogers would say, which of those possible selves is going to get you towards that goal, right? The problem is when we focus on the self is that it's definitely good to focus on ourself enough, but we, unlike like one of those Maslow criticisms, focusing on the self too much, especially if you focus on your own problems too much, can lead to a really negative problem and lead to something that we call the spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is basically, sorry, I forgot what the next slide was. The spotlight effect is basically thinking too intensely about a situation, and then you basically doom yourself by overthinking. In this case, we call that rumination, by the way. Too much thinking about a certain situation, how you could have done it differently, what you did wrong, going over all of those things, thinking that you're trash, is negative. And so the spotlight effect is almost like something that's really tiny, that's not even significant. You make into this big thing, and it's almost like somebody has a giant spotlight on it. So I like to use the example of you have a new date, a blind date maybe, or a date with somebody that you've had a thing for a little bit, and on the day of the first date you realize you have a zit, and you're like, oh crud. And so you try to either cover it up with makeup, and all you're doing is now thinking about this. I have this blemish on my body and it's going to be so noticeable and all of this, and you build it up and intensely focus on the negative, and all of a sudden it's like somebody has a giant spotlight on you, and it's like the zit is now the size of half of your face, even though it's probably a good chance that that other person won't even notice. They might be so nervous that they're not even looking you in the face, and things like that. So this idea can lead to the spotlight effect. In sports, we hear sometimes, like in football, you have a guy on defense that's covering the wide receiver and has to stay with them step for step. And if they think about it too much, are they going to be faster than me? Are they going to run this route? Are they going to do this? All of a sudden, by the time you look up, they're gone, right? Because you've been focused too much on it. And instead, focus on the situation and try not to focus on, what your steps are. So that's the idea, and we don't want to lead that way. So I also want to make sure that we detect the difference between self-esteem that we've been talking about in this chapter with Maslow's needs and self-efficacy. Self-esteem is our overall feelings of self-worth. Are we worthy of life, of friends, of things like that? That's our feelings. If you've heard the term self-efficacy, that's our sense of competence in a specific task. So I think teaching, I'm very high self-efficacy, but certain things like certain video games or certain tasks that I'm not very good at, especially art, my self-efficacy is pretty low. My self-esteem overall, pretty darn good. So we know also in studies of the self that high self-esteem, having a good sense of self-worth, correlates with less pressure to conform to others in society and maybe be more of a leader or be on your own. Whereas less self-esteem, you want to just be part of this group. It's also correlates high with persistence at difficult tasks, setting higher and higher goals like Maslow and Rogers talked about, and with overall happiness, being satisfied with yourself and not too nitpicky over the problems in your life or things like that. The thing is the direction of the correlation is not clear. Is it high self-esteem that makes you better at these things? Or is it the fact that you do these things that lead to overall high self-esteem? Does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? No, it's just an interesting thing to think about. So really, I just wanted to get you guys to understand the difference here. Could, just like thinking too much leads to a bad place, could self-esteem, we all want a good measure of high self-esteem, but is there such thing as too high, excessive self-esteem or optimism? And yes, again, we see this in the president. One of the things that excessive optimism might do is lead to complacency. So if you already think you're the best at everything, you're not going to practice and you're not going to do as well. It may lead to just being complacent. It may prevent you from recognizing the real risks because you just think that you're perfect at everything, and so you don't even see any potential downsides that could happen. When you're dealing with temptations, that actually may be more self-defeating, because you're like, oh, I'm never going to develop a drinking problem, an addiction, so I can have as many drinks as I want and never have to worry about it. And so again, that may go back up one, and you're not recognizing that there's a real risk, especially if you have a family history. This could be for yourself, or it could be directed toward a group that think, that nothing's ever wrong and everything's perfect with them. As humans, we are naturally imperfect. So to think in a way of perfection, right, is actually a bad way of going about things. And if you ever wondered, is there a disease or a disorder, mental, psychological disorder? Yes, it's called narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder. So in this case, you could be blind to one's own incompetence. Again, the president thinks he's perfect at everything, and if anything goes wrong, it's not his fault. So the people that are most overconfident is when they are most incompetent. And we see this in his speeches, in the way that he delivers things. Of course, you don't have to believe me, but the proof is in the pudding. It takes competence to recognize competence. And some people who just think that they're the best at everything, they don't recognize it. So this serves as what we call a self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is a bias to perceive yourself more favorably than you actually should, think that you're the best. Now, it is human nature, it really is, to accept praise when something good happens and to deflect blame when something bad happens. There are theories about religion that says that when bad things were happening that were out of humans' control, they said, oh, there must be something else above us that created it, that's creating this mess. And they were very willing to give praise to all the good things, but blame to all the bad things. I'm not saying that that's the basis for religion. I'm saying that's some people's theory. So people accept more responsibility for good deeds than bad, and more for success than failure. That's human nature. But some people, if your self-esteem is too high, you take it to a different extreme. So it creates I'm better than average at everything effect. And so I don't need to practice as much, and all criticism should be directed elsewhere. And obviously this underlies a whole range of other conflicts. And again, we can see that. I'm not to blame for this, everybody else did, right? Blah, 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 blah. Again, we can go back to Freud and talk about projection. I'm the only one here that's doing things right, and everybody else is wrong, right? So the last thing we're going to talk about is that researchers propose there are two types of self-esteem. One that is more fragile. This seems to be the anxiety, sort of pessimistic thinking people, which is threatened by things like failure and criticism, more vulnerable to threats. Words may hurt more. It feeds more anger and feelings of vulnerability and lower self-esteem. And then there's the secure self-esteem, which is less fragile. We don't care as much about what others think. It's less contingent on what other people think of us and more about how we feel about ourselves. And these are the people that are more likely to achieve a greater quality of life, because they're not going to conform. They're not going to just, take a couple criticisms to heart. They're going to persist and know that they're doing a good job, and it's going to lead to a better happiness and greater quality of life. So that is the chapter on personality. I hope you enjoyed it. And we only got one more chapter left, folks. I'll see you and talk to you soon.